In the empty parking lot of Riverside High School, four teenagers cornered their new English teacher with 50 feet of climbing rope, thinking they'd found the perfect victim. What they discovered instead would send shockwaves through this small Michigan town and prove that sometimes the quietest people carry the deadliest secrets. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell and the moment her students learned that appearances can be devastatingly deceiving. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn leaves crunched under Sarah Mitchell's sensible flats as she walked across the faculty parking lot of Riverside High School, her leather messenger bag weighing heavy on her shoulder. At 28, she looked every inch the stereotypical English teacher with her wire-rimmed glasses, cream-colored cardigan, and hair pulled back in a practical bun. Cedar Falls, Michigan wasn't exactly where she'd imagined herself 5 years ago, but life had a way of redirecting dreams into unexpected channels. The small industrial town of 12,000 people offered exactly what Sarah had been seeking after her previous career burned her out completely. Quiet streets lined with maple trees, a pace of life that moved with the seasons rather than deadlines, and most importantly, anonymity. Nobody here knew about her past, about the specialized training that had once defined her entire existence, or about the reasons she'd walked away from a lucrative position that most people would kill for. Sarah's first morning at Riverside High had been blissfully ordinary. She'd arranged her classroom exactly how she envisioned it, with inspirational quotes about literature covering the walls and desks arranged in collaborative circles rather than intimidating rows. Room 204 smelled like fresh paint and possibility, and she'd spent hours the previous weekend making sure every detail reflected her vision of what education could be when it focused on nurturing rather than controlling. Her husband Mark had driven her to school that first day, his engineer's mind already calculating the most efficient route from their small rental house to the building. He'd squeezed her hand before she got out of the car, his brown eyes warm with encouragement. This was their fresh start, their chance to build the peaceful life they'd both craved after years of high-stress careers that had consumed their early 20s. The principal, Mr. Harrison, had given Sarah a perfunctory tour during her interview, his tired eyes and slouched shoulders suggesting a man who'd long ago stopped fighting administrative battles. He'd mentioned in passing that the previous English teacher had resigned unexpectedly in October, leaving mid-semester with little explanation beyond, quote, personal reasons. Sarah hadn't pressed for details, assuming it was a family emergency or health issue that required privacy. What she discovered during her first week was far more troubling. The classroom had an undercurrent of tension that seemed disproportionate to typical teenage behavior. Students whispered among themselves when they thought she couldn't hear, and there was a particular group of four who seemed to watch her with calculating eyes that made her skin crawl. Jake Rodriguez, Connor Walsh, Aiden Brooks, and Chloe Patterson moved through the hallways like they owned them, their confidence bordering on arrogance. Jake was clearly the leader, a 17-year-old senior whose father owned the largest manufacturing plant in town. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, his clothes expensive, and his smile carried an edge that never quite reached his eyes. Connor provided the physical intimidation factor, a broad-shouldered junior who'd clearly spent serious time in the weight room and wore his strength like a warning. Aiden handled the social dynamics, constantly documenting everything on his phone with the dedication of a war correspondent, while Chloe orchestrated the group's activities with the precision of a military strategist. During her second week, Sarah began noticing the small acts of psychological warfare that had apparently driven her predecessor away. Her coffee mug would disappear from the faculty lounge, only to reappear in strange locations around the school. Important papers would vanish from her desk, forcing her to recreate lesson plans and grading sheets. Someone had figured out how to change her computer password, locking her out of the gradebook system at crucial moments. The harassment escalated gradually, each incident carefully designed to appear like coincidence or oversight. Her car tires were let down just enough to be noticeable, but not flat. Fake parent complaint emails flooded her school account, each one more creative and vicious than the last. Anonymous notes appeared in her mailbox, criticizing everything from her teaching methods to her appearance, written in different handwriting to avoid detection. Mrs. Chen, a veteran social studies teacher who'd been at Riverside for 15 years, had tried to warn Sarah during lunch one day. The older woman's weathered face was creased with concern as she leaned across the faculty room table, her voice barely above a whisper. She explained that certain students in this town believed they were untouchable due to their family's influence, and that challenging them had consequences that extended far beyond the classroom walls. Sarah had listened politely, but internally she'd bristled at the suggestion that she should simply tolerate harassment. Her previous career had taught her that backing down from bullies only encouraged them to escalate their behavior, and every instinct she possessed told her that these particular students were testing her limits methodically, probing for weaknesses they could exploit. What none of them realized was that Sarah Mitchell's quiet demeanor masked a skill set that most people couldn't imagine in their worst nightmares. Her previous job as a civilian contractor had required her to train military personnel and private security teams in close-quarters combat, specifically in Krav Maga techniques designed for real-world survival situations. She'd spent 3 years teaching soldiers how to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently, how to turn everyday objects into weapons, and how to read body language for signs of impending violence. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd left that world specifically to avoid conflict, only to find herself targeted by teenagers who had no idea they were poking a sleeping predator with a stick. The harassment reached a new level during Sarah's 3rd week, when she discovered someone had broken into her classroom overnight. Nothing was stolen, but her carefully arranged desk had been ransacked, with papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Her personal photos of Mark and their golden retriever Charlie had been turned face down, and someone had used white chalk to write crude messages on her blackboard that made her stomach turn. Mr. Harrison barely looked up from his paperwork when Sarah reported the incident. His response, a tired sigh, followed by a promise to look into it, that carried all the conviction of a weather forecast. He suggested she might want to be more careful about locking her door, as if the break-in was somehow her fault for trusting the security of her own workplace. The custodial staff, led by a kind man named Roberto who'd worked at the school for over a decade, had helped Sarah clean up the mess. His weathered hands moved efficiently as he erased the chalk messages, but his eyes held a sadness that spoke of having witnessed this behavior before. When Sarah asked if he'd seen anything suspicious, Roberto simply shook his head and muttered something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer. The psychological campaign intensified throughout October. Sarah's lunch would disappear from the faculty refrigerator, replaced with moldy sandwiches that reeked of spoiled meat. Her lesson plans, carefully crafted the night before, would vanish from her computer only to reappear with crucial sections deleted or replaced with inappropriate content that would have been career-ending if she hadn't caught it in time. The 4 students responsible were careful never to be caught in the act, but their smug expressions during class made their involvement obvious. Jake would lean back in his chair with a satisfied smirk whenever Sarah discovered a new form of sabotage, while Connor cracked his knuckles in a way that suggested barely contained violence. Aiden documented everything with his phone, creating what Sarah suspected was a highlight reel of her humiliation, and Chloe orchestrated the timing of each incident with military precision. Maya Santos, a quiet sophomore who reminded Sarah of herself at that age, had started staying after class to help clean up the daily messes. The girl never said much, but her dark eyes held an understanding that went beyond her years. She seemed to recognize that Sarah was fighting a battle that extended far beyond typical classroom management, and her silent support became one of the few bright spots in Sarah's increasingly difficult days. The breaking point came on a gray Thursday afternoon in late October, when the temperature had dropped enough to require a heavy coat, but the sky couldn't decide between rain and snow. Sarah had stayed late to grade papers, hoping the empty building would provide the peace she needed to focus on her students' essays about courage and heroism. The irony of the assignment wasn't lost on her as she struggled with her own situation. The school felt different after hours, with long shadows stretching down empty hallways and the normal sounds of teenage energy replaced by the whisper of wind against windows. Sarah packed her materials into her messenger bag around 6 o'clock, when the custodial crew would normally be finishing their rounds and heading home for the evening. She pushed through the main doors into the parking lot, surprised to find her small Honda Civic surrounded by 4 figures who'd been waiting in the darkening afternoon. Jake, Connor, Aiden, and Chloe stood in formation around her car like they'd choreographed the confrontation, their faces partially hidden by the hoods of their winter jackets. The parking lot was otherwise empty, the last of the faculty having left an hour earlier. Sarah's footsteps echoed against the asphalt as she approached her vehicle, every instinct she possessed, screaming warnings that she forced herself to ignore. These were just teenagers, she reminded herself, not enemy combatants in a war zone. Jake stepped forward first, his hands behind his back in a way that immediately triggered Sarah's tactical training. The positioning was wrong. Too deliberate, too coordinated for a casual encounter. Connor moved to block her path to the driver's side door, while Aiden raised his phone to start recording. Chloe flanked her left side, completing what any security professional would recognize as a textbook intimidation formation. The conversation started with mock politeness, Jake's voice dripping with false concern as he asked if Sarah was enjoying her time at Riverside High. His tone carried undertones of threat that made her skin crawl, each word carefully chosen to sound innocent to anyone who might overhear while conveying unmistakable menace to the target. Connor produced the rope from behind his back with theatrical flair, 50 feet of climbing rope that looked like it had been borrowed from the school's physical education department. The thick braided cord gleamed dully in the parking lot's overhead lights, and Sarah's military training immediately categorized it as a weapon with multiple potential applications for restraint or strangulation. The teenagers seemed to think they were playing an elaborate prank, their nervous laughter and excited whispers suggesting they'd planned this moment for weeks. Aiden's phone captured every second as Jake began explaining their intention to, quote, teach the new teacher some respect by using the rope to tie her to her car until she agreed to quit her position and leave town. What they didn't realize was that their carefully planned intimidation tactic had just activated responses in Sarah's. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Nervous system that had been honed through years of training with some of the world's most dangerous people. Her breathing automatically regulated itself into the controlled pattern she'd been taught for high-stress situations. Her peripheral vision expanded to track all 4 threats simultaneously, while her weight shifted almost imperceptibly onto the balls of her feet. The part of her mind that had been suppressed since arriving in Cedar Falls suddenly blazed to life with crystalline clarity. She calculated distances, identified improvised weapons within reach, and assessed the tactical advantages of her position relative to her attackers. The messenger bag on her shoulder contained a heavy thermos that could serve as a bludgeon. Her car keys could be used to strike vulnerable points, and the concrete parking blocks provided obstacles she could use to control the engagement area. Jake continued talking, apparently mistaking her silence for fear, as he detailed their plan to humiliate her into submission. Connor began uncoiling the rope with practiced movements that suggested they'd rehearsed this scenario multiple times. Aiden zoomed in with his camera to capture what he assumed would be Sarah's tearful surrender, while Chloe watched the school building to ensure no witnesses interrupted their carefully orchestrated performance. None of them noticed the subtle changes in Sarah's posture that would have been obvious to anyone trained in reading pre-combat indicators. Her shoulders squared almost imperceptibly, her stance widened by inches that created better balance and mobility, and her hands moved from defensive positions to neutral-ready stances that could transition instantly into offensive applications. The quiet English teacher they thought they were terrorizing had just disappeared, replaced by someone whose muscle memory contained responses to threats that these small-town bullies couldn't begin to comprehend. The transformation happened in the space between heartbeats. One moment, Sarah Mitchell was a mild-mannered English teacher clutching her messenger bag in a darkening parking lot, and the next, she was someone entirely different. The shift wasn't visible to the 4 teenagers surrounding her, but every cell in her body had just received a message that had been dormant for 3 years. Jake made the first tactical error by stepping closer, while Connor began fashioning a crude noose with practiced movements that suggested this wasn't their first time using rope as an intimidation tool. The 17-year-old's confidence radiated from his expensive jacket and perfectly styled hair as he gestured for Aiden to get a better camera angle of what they assumed would be their teacher's complete breakdown. Sarah's voice, when she finally spoke, carried none of the gentle warmth her students had grown accustomed to hearing during literature discussions. The words came out flat and controlled, each syllable precisely articulated in a way that should have triggered warning signals in anyone with functioning survival instincts. She asked them once to step away from her vehicle and return to their homes. The request was delivered without emotion, without pleading, and without the fear they'd been expecting to hear. Jake laughed in response, a sound that echoed off the empty school building, and seemed to encourage his companions to press their advantage. Connor moved first, lunging forward with the rope stretched between his hands like a garrote. His football training had taught him to rely on size and strength to overpower smaller opponents, and Sarah's petite frame had convinced him this would be over before it started. He had no way of knowing that his telegraphed attack was exactly the kind of aggressive approach that Krav Maga practitioners trained specifically to counter. Sarah's response was immediate and devastating. Her left hand shot up to deflect Connor's right wrist, while her right elbow drove into his solar plexus with surgical precision. The strike wasn't wild or emotional, but calculated to disrupt his breathing and motor control without causing permanent damage. Connor's forward momentum carried him past her as he doubled over, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The rope fell from his nerveless fingers as Sarah pivoted to face Jake, who had frozen mid-step with his mouth hanging open. Aiden's phone captured every frame of Connor's collapse, but the boy behind the camera seemed too stunned to process what he was witnessing. Chloe took an involuntary step backward, her carefully planned coordination crumbling as the scenario spiraled beyond their control. Jake's shock lasted approximately 2 seconds before his privileged teenager's sense of invincibility reasserted itself. He'd grown up in a town where his father's money and influence had shielded him from consequences, and the idea that a teacher might actually fight back simply didn't compute in his worldview. His response was to charge forward with his fists raised, apparently believing that teenage aggression could overcome professional training. Sarah's counter was a textbook example of redirecting an attacker's energy against himself. She sidestepped Jake's wild swing while grabbing his extended arm, using his own momentum to send him crashing into the side of her Honda Civic with a metallic impact that echoed across the empty parking lot. His designer jacket scraped against the car's paint as he slumped to the asphalt, stunned by the sudden reversal of fortune. Aiden finally lowered his phone, his face pale in the overhead lighting as the reality of their situation began to penetrate his teenage brain. He'd expected to film their teacher's humiliation, not document his friends being systematically dismantled by someone who moved with the fluid precision of a trained fighter. His fingers trembled as he realized the video he'd captured could potentially destroy all 4 of their futures. Chloe, who'd always prided herself on being the smartest member of their group, was the first to recognize that they'd catastrophically misjudged their target. Her organizational skills, which had served her well in planning pranks and psychological warfare, now focused entirely on damage control and escape. She backed toward the school building, her mind racing through possible explanations for what any witness might have seen. Sarah stood in the center of the parking lot, her breathing controlled and her posture relaxed, despite having just neutralized 2 attackers in less than 30 seconds. Her messenger bag remained securely on her shoulder, and her glasses hadn't even shifted on her nose. The only visible sign of exertion was a slight flush in her cheeks that could have been attributed to the cool evening air. Connor was still struggling to breathe properly, his hands pressed against his chest as he tried to make sense of what had happened to him. His football experience included plenty of hard hits, but none had left him feeling so completely helpless and confused. The precision of Sarah's strike had disrupted his nervous system in ways that his 17-year-old brain couldn't process or categorize. Jake pulled himself upright using the car's door handle, his expensive clothing now wrinkled and his carefully styled hair disheveled. A thin line of blood trickled from his split lip where it had connected with the vehicle's metal surface. His dark eyes held a mixture of rage and bewilderment as he stared at the woman who'd just treated him like a child throwing a tantrum rather than a serious threat. The parking lot fell silent except for Connor's labored breathing and the distant sound of traffic on Cedar Falls main road. Streetlights flickered on automatically as the October evening deepened into true darkness, casting long shadows that made the scene feel even more surreal. Sarah's voice, when she spoke again, carried the same controlled tone that had preceded the violence. She informed the 4 teenagers that they had approximately 30 seconds to collect themselves and leave the school grounds before she contacted both the police and their parents. Her words were delivered without malice or satisfaction, simply as a statement of immediate consequences for their actions. Aiden's phone had automatically saved the video to his cloud storage, creating a permanent record of their failed intimidation attempt and the teacher's unexpected response. The footage showed 4 students attacking their instructor with rope and being effortlessly defeated by someone who appeared to possess advanced martial arts training. Even edited selectively, the video would be impossible to explain in any way that portrayed them as victims. The rope lay abandoned on the asphalt, like a discarded prop from a play that had gone horribly wrong. Connor managed to stand upright, though his movements remained unsteady and his face had taken on a greenish pallor that suggested nausea. Jake wiped blood from his lip with the back of his hand, his privileged worldview cracking like ice under pressure. Chloe was the first to move toward the school building, her organizational instincts telling her to put distance between herself and the woman who'd just shattered their carefully constructed power dynamic. Aiden followed, clutching his phone like a lifeline while his mind struggled to process the implications of what he'd recorded. The four teenagers who'd arrived with rope and cruel intentions now faced the reality that their new English teacher was someone far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined possible. The four students stumbled away from the parking lot in stunned silence, their confident swagger replaced by the uncertain gait of people whose fundamental understanding of the world had just been violently restructured. Connor still moved gingerly, one hand pressed against his ribs where Sarah's elbow had connected with devastating precision. Jake's split lip had swollen noticeably, and he kept touching it with his tongue as if he couldn't quite believe someone had actually hurt him. Aiden clutched his phone with white knuckles, the device containing evidence that could either destroy their reputations or potentially be weaponized against the teacher who'd humiliated them. His mind raced through possible editing techniques that might salvage their position, though the raw footage clearly showed four students attacking one woman with rope and being systematically defeated. Chloe's organizational mind had shifted into damage control mode, calculating which adults might believe their version of events, and which school policies they could potentially invoke to turn the situation to their advantage. Her family had connections throughout Cedar Falls' small power structure, relationships that could be leveraged if they moved quickly and strategically. Sarah remained in the parking lot long after their footsteps faded into the distance, her body still humming with the adrenaline that always followed combat situations. The familiar chemical rush brought back memories she'd worked hard to suppress, moments from her previous career when split-second decisions had meant the difference between life and death for the people she'd trained. Her hands shook slightly as she unlocked her Honda Civic, not from fear but from the physiological aftermath of transitioning between her two identities. The mild-mannered English teacher and the combat instructor existed in separate compartments of her psyche, and crossing between them always left her feeling disoriented and emotionally raw. The drive home through Cedar Falls' quiet residential streets felt surreal after the violence of the parking lot encounter. Halloween decorations adorned front porches with cheerful orange pumpkins and friendly ghosts, a stark contrast to the very real threat she'd just neutralized. Sarah found herself automatically checking her rearview mirror for surveillance, old habits reasserting themselves despite the peaceful suburban environment. Mark was grading engineering blueprints at their kitchen table when she walked through the front door, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that always made her heart skip. Their golden retriever Charlie bounded over with his usual enthusiasm, tail wagging furiously as he sensed the tension radiating from his favorite human. Sarah sat heavily in the chair, across from her husband, suddenly feeling every one of her 28 years. Mark looked up from his work, his engineer's eye immediately cataloging the subtle signs of stress in her posture and expression. He'd learned to read these indicators during their courtship, when she'd been transitioning out of her previous career and struggling with nightmares that she couldn't fully explain. The story poured out of her in a steady stream, from the weeks of escalating harassment to the confrontation in the parking lot. Mark listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly grim as she described the rope and the student's obvious intention to physically restrain her. When she reached the part about neutralizing both boys, his eyebrows rose with something that might have been pride mixed with concern. They'd met during Sarah's final year as a contractor, when Mark's engineering firm had been hired to design security systems for the training facility where she worked. He'd been one of the few people who'd known about her specialized skills, and he'd supported her decision to walk away from that world when the psychological toll became too heavy to bear. Mark reached across the table to squeeze her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her palm. He pointed out that she'd acted in self-defense against 4 attackers who'd brought rope with clear malicious intent, but they both knew that small-town politics rarely operated on legal principles alone. Sarah's greatest fear wasn't prosecution but exposure. having her carefully constructed new identity stripped away by teenagers with smartphones and social media accounts. They spent the evening researching Michigan's self-defense laws and discussing potential scenarios for how the situation might unfold. Mark's methodical engineering approach proved useful for analyzing the various ways their peaceful life could be disrupted, though neither of them had much appetite for the leftover chili that had been planned for dinner. Sarah barely slept that night, her mind cycling through combat scenarios and defensive strategies that had no place in a suburban bedroom decorated with photographs of their hiking trips and Charlie's various chew toys. She'd spent 3 years learning to suppress these thought patterns, but a single moment of violence had apparently reactivated neural pathways she'd thought were permanently dormant. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that seemed to match Sarah's internal emotional state. She dressed in her usual cardigan and sensible shoes, but the person looking back from the bathroom mirror felt like a stranger wearing someone else's costume. The teacher identity that had felt so natural just days ago now seemed like an elaborate performance designed to hide her true nature. Cedar Falls buzzed with rumors by the time Sarah arrived at Riverside High School. The teenage rumor mill had processed the parking lot incident overnight, transforming it into increasingly dramatic versions that bore little resemblance to actual events. Some stories had Sarah attacking students unprovoked, while others painted her as some kind of secret agent or military operative. Mr. Harrison was waiting in her classroom when she arrived, his tired eyes more alert than she'd ever seen them. His normally disheveled appearance had been replaced by the crisp professionalism of an administrator who suddenly realized his career might be in jeopardy. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable, with Harrison explaining that concerned parents had already called the school board about reports of teacher violence. The 4 students who'd confronted her were notably absent from first period, though their friends whispered among themselves with the excited energy of people who sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented. Maya Santos caught Sarah's eye during the lesson on metaphors and poetry, her dark gaze holding a mixture of concern and curiosity that suggested she'd heard at least some version of the previous evening's events. Lunchtime brought an unexpected visitor to Sarah's classroom. David Kim, a quiet senior who rarely spoke during class discussions, appeared in her doorway with the nervous energy of someone who'd made a difficult decision. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, and his hands shook slightly as he pulled out his own smartphone. David explained that he'd been in the school building late yesterday, working on a project for the robotics club, when he'd heard voices in the parking lot. Curiosity had drawn him to the window, where he'd witnessed the entire confrontation from beginning to end. His phone contained video footage shot from a different angle than Aiden's, clearly showing the rope, the coordinated approach, and Sarah's defensive response to what was obviously a planned attack. The quiet senior's moral compass had apparently wrestled with the decision all night before he'd chosen to come forward with evidence that supported Sarah's version of events. His video included audio that captured Jake's threats and Connor's aggressive approach, providing context that would be crucial if the situation escalated to legal proceedings. Sarah felt a wave of relief so intense it made her knees weak, followed immediately by anxiety about what David's intervention might mean for his own safety in a school where the 4 attackers still held significant social power. David Kim's revelation transformed everything in the span of a single conversation. The quiet senior's video footage provided irrefutable evidence that Sarah had acted in self-defense against a coordinated attack by 4 students who'd brought rope with obvious malicious intent. His hands trembled as he showed her the crystal-clear images captured from the second-floor robotics lab window, each frame documenting the premeditated nature of their assault. The video began with the 4 students positioning themselves around Sarah's car in what any security expert would recognize as a classic ambush formation. Jake's voice carried clearly across the parking lot as he outlined their intention to tie her up until she agreed to quit her position, while Connor's practiced movements with the rope suggested they'd rehearsed this scenario multiple times. The audio quality was exceptional, capturing every threat and cruel laugh that preceded the physical confrontation. Sarah watched herself on David's screen, seeing for the first time how dramatically her demeanor had shifted in those crucial seconds before Connor's attack. The transformation was visible even from David's distant vantage point, her posture changing from that of a startled teacher to someone with obvious tactical training. The actual combat lasted less than 30 seconds, but the video captured every precise movement that had neutralized both attackers. David explained that he'd wrestled with his conscience throughout the night, knowing that coming forward might make him a target for retaliation from Jake's influential family or Connor's athletic supporters. His decision to support Sarah had come after watching Aiden's edited version spread across social media, a deliberately misleading clip that portrayed her as an unprovoked aggressor attacking innocent students. The contrast between the two videos was stark and damning. Aiden's footage began with Sarah's first strike against Connor, carefully omitting the rope, the threats, and the coordinated positioning that preceded the violence. David's comprehensive recording told the complete story, showing 4 teenagers stalking their teacher with clear criminal intent and facing consequences for their actions. Sarah felt a mixture of gratitude and concern as she accepted David's offer to provide the evidence to school administrators. The quiet senior was risking his social standing and potentially his safety to do what he believed was right, a level of moral courage that reminded her why she'd chosen teaching as her new career path. The meeting with Principal Harrison occurred within an hour of David's revelation, the administrator's demeanor shifting dramatically as he watched the unedited footage on Sarah's laptop. His previous stance of cautious neutrality evaporated when confronted with clear evidence of premeditated assault by students whose families wielded considerable influence in Cedar Falls' small community. Harrison's face grew progressively paler as the video played, his tired eyes widening with each threatening word captured by David's smartphone. The principal's political instincts, honed through years of navigating small-town educational bureaucracy, immediately recognized the potential liability nightmare facing the school district. 4 students had attempted to physically restrain a teacher with rope in the school parking lot, creating legal exposure that could destroy careers and drain budgets through litigation. The administrator's transformation from conflict-avoidant bureaucrat to decisive leader was remarkable to witness. Harrison immediately contacted the school district's legal counsel, the local police department, and the superintendent's office, his previous lethargy replaced by the focused energy of someone whose career suddenly depended on making correct decisions quickly. Within 2 hours, Cedar Falls Police Detective Lieutenant Maria Gonzalez was reviewing David's footage in the principal's office, her experienced eyes cataloging the numerous criminal violations captured in high definition. The veteran investigator had dealt with enough assault cases to recognize the coordinated nature of the attack and the clear self-defense justification for Sarah's response. Detective Gonzalez's questions were thorough but respectful, focusing on the timeline of harassment that had preceded the parking lot confrontation. Sarah found herself describing weeks of psychological warfare with the clinical detachment she'd learned during her previous career, each incident documented with the precision of someone trained to compile after-action reports. The detective's interest sharpened when Sarah mentioned her background in military contractor training, though she carefully avoided specifics about classified programs or overseas deployments. Gonzalez had worked with enough veterans to recognize the signs of specialized combat training, and Sarah's measured responses during questioning confirmed her suspicions about the teacher's unusual qualifications. By late Friday afternoon, arrest warrants had been issued for all 4 students involved in the parking lot incident. Jake Rodriguez faced charges of assault, conspiracy, and making terroristic threats, while Connor Walsh was charged with assault and attempted unlawful restraint. Aiden Brooks was charged with conspiracy and tampering with evidence for his deliberately misleading social media posts, and Chloe Patterson faced conspiracy charges for her role in organizing the attack. The arrest of Jake Rodriguez sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls' small business community, where his father's manufacturing plant employed nearly a quarter of the town's workforce. The elder Rodriguez's attempts to use political influence to minimize his son's legal troubles ran headlong into Detective Gonzalez's reputation for thorough investigations and District Attorney Rebecca Walsh's commitment to prosecuting assault cases regardless of the perpetrator's family connections. Connor Walsh's arrest was equally dramatic, with the 17-year-old linebacker removed from Friday night's homecoming game in handcuffs as his teammates watched in stunned silence. The visual of their strongest player being led away by police officers destroyed the football team's morale and sparked intense speculation about what could have prompted such serious charges. Aiden Brooks discovered that his social media manipulation had created additional legal problems when Detective Gonzalez traced his edited video through various platforms, documenting how he deliberately misrepresented the incident to portray Sarah as the aggressor. His attempts to delete the original posts only strengthened the tampering with evidence charges, as digital forensics experts recovered every version of his misleading content. Chloe Patterson's arrest was perhaps the most shocking to the school community, as her reputation as an honor student and future valedictorian had shielded her from suspicion in previous harassment campaigns. The revelation that she'd been the organizational mastermind behind weeks of psychological warfare against Sarah dismantled her carefully constructed image of academic excellence and moral leadership. The weekend brought a media storm that transformed sleepy Cedar Falls into the center of a national conversation about school safety, teacher protection, and the consequences of teenage bullying. Local news outlets picked up the story first, but social media amplification quickly drew attention from regional and national news organizations hungry for compelling content. Sarah found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight as journalists attempted to contact her for interviews and commentary. Her refusal to speak publicly only intensified speculation about her background and training, with online investigators attempting to piece together her previous career through social media posts and public records. Mark proved invaluable during this chaotic period, his engineer's methodical approach helping them navigate the constant phone calls and unexpected visitors. He'd taken time off from his own job to handle media inquiries and protect Sarah from the overwhelming attention that threatened to disrupt their carefully constructed, peaceful life. The school district's response was swift and comprehensive, with Superintendent Jennifer Martinez issuing a public statement condemning the attack and praising Sarah's professionalism throughout the ordeal. Martinez, a former teacher herself, recognized the precedent-setting nature of the case and the importance of supporting educators who faced violence in their workplace. The 4 arrested students were immediately suspended pending the outcome of their criminal cases, a decision that sparked protests from some parents who argued their children were being treated too harshly for what they characterized as a, quote, prank gone wrong. These protests quickly faded when David's complete video footage was released to local media, showing the premeditated and coordinated nature of the assault. Maya Santos emerged as an unexpected advocate for Sarah during the media firestorm, the quiet sophomore organizing a student petition supporting their English teacher and condemning the harassment she'd endured. Maya's eloquent description of Sarah's dedication to her students and the positive changes she'd brought to Room 204 provided a counter-narrative to the sensationalized news coverage. Mrs. Chen, the veteran social studies teacher who'd tried to warn Sarah about the dangerous dynamics at Riverside High, became an invaluable ally during the aftermath. Her 15 years of experience navigating small-town politics proved crucial in identifying which community members could be trusted and which were likely to cause additional problems. The legal proceedings moved forward with unusual speed, thanks to the overwhelming evidence provided by David's video and the prosecutor's determination to send a clear message about consequences for violence against educators. Defense attorneys struggled to craft plausible explanations for their clients' actions when confronted with footage showing rope, threats, and coordinated positioning around an isolated victim. Jake Rodriguez's family hired expensive attorneys from Grand Rapids who attempted to argue that their client's words were protected speech and that Sarah's response was disproportionate to the threat. This strategy collapsed when expert witnesses testified about the legitimate fear that rope-wielding attackers would generate in any reasonable person, particularly someone isolated in an empty parking lot after dark. Connor Walsh's defense team tried to portray the football player as a follower who'd been manipulated by Jake's leadership, but the video clearly showed Connor taking initiative in fashioning the rope into a restraint device and making the first aggressive move towards Sarah. His size advantage and athletic training actually worked against him in court, as prosecutors successfully argued that his physical capabilities made him particularly dangerous to a smaller victim. Aiden Brooks faced additional charges when investigators discovered his pattern of creating and distributing misleading videos about other teachers and students, revealing a systematic campaign of harassment that extended far beyond the parking lot incident. His digital footprint contained evidence of cyberbullying activities that had contributed to the previous English teacher's resignation and several other faculty departures. Chloe Patterson's carefully constructed image as a model student crumbled completely when investigators found detailed plans for psychological warfare against Sarah hidden in her personal devices. Her organizational skills, which had once been praised by teachers and college recruiters, had been weaponized to systematically destroy an educator's professional reputation and emotional well-being. The trial garnered national attention as a test case for teacher protection and self-defense rights in educational settings. Legal experts debated the implications of Sarah's response on news programs and opinion websites, with most concluding that she'd acted appropriately given the circumstances and the clear threat posed by 4 coordinated attackers. Sarah's military contractor background became public knowledge during the proceedings, though she successfully maintained privacy about specific programs and assignments. The revelation that Riverside High had unknowingly hired someone with advanced combat training sparked discussions about background checks and the hidden skills that educators might possess. The testimony phase of the trial provided dramatic moments as witnesses described the systematic harassment campaign that had preceded the parking lot confrontation. Roberto, the custodian, testified about finding Sarah's classroom vandalized multiple times and his frustration with the administration's inadequate response to obvious criminal activity. David Kim's decision to testify proved pivotal in establishing the premeditated nature of the attack, his quiet demeanor and obvious reluctance to be involved adding credibility to his account. The Robotics Club members' detailed description of watching the assault through the lab window provided the jury with a neutral observer's perspective on events. Maya Santos testified about the positive changes Sarah had brought to her English classes and the obvious distress the harassment had caused their dedicated teacher. The sophomore's mature articulation of complex emotional dynamics impressed court observers and reinforced the prosecution's argument that Sarah had been an innocent victim of coordinated cruelty. Mrs. Chen's testimony about the pattern of teacher intimidation at Riverside High provided crucial context for understanding why the 4 students had believed they could act with impunity. Her description of previous educators who'd been driven away by similar harassment campaigns established a clear motive for the assault. The defense's attempts to portray Sarah as a dangerous individual who'd overreacted to harmless teenage behavior fell apart under cross-examination. Expert witnesses in self-defense law testified that her response had been proportionate and necessary given the coordination of the attack and the obvious threat posed by the rope. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against all 4 defendants. Jake Rodriguez was sentenced to 2 years in juvenile detention followed by extensive community service, while Connor Walsh received 18 months detention and mandatory anger management counseling. Aiden Brooks faced additional penalties for his digital manipulation activities, receiving 15 months detention and a 5-year ban on social media platforms. Chloe Patterson's sentence included 12 months detention and psychological counseling to address the manipulative behaviors that had enabled her to organize harassment campaigns. The civil lawsuit filed by Sarah's attorney against the 4 families resulted in substantial financial settlements that covered her legal expenses and provided compensation for the emotional distress caused by weeks of systematic harassment. The Rodriguez family's attempt to use their economic influence to minimize consequences backfired spectacularly when their son's conviction became public knowledge. The school district implemented comprehensive anti-harassment policies in response to the case, with mandatory training for administrators about recognizing and responding to systematic intimidation campaigns. Principal Harrison underwent additional education about legal liability and the importance of taking teacher complaints seriously regardless of the social status of accused students. Riverside High's culture began shifting dramatically as news of the conviction spread through the student body. The protection that wealth and athletic achievement had previously provided to certain students evaporated overnight, replaced by awareness that actions had consequences regardless of family connections or social position. Sarah's return to teaching after the trial was met with overwhelming support from students and faculty who'd witnessed her grace under pressure and professional dedication throughout the ordeal. Room 204 became a symbol of resilience and justice, with students requesting transfers specifically to study with the teacher who'd become famous for standing up to bullies. The English department at Riverside High experienced a renaissance, as Sarah's reputation attracted talented educators who wanted to work in an environment where administration supported faculty against harassment. The school's academic performance improved markedly, as teachers felt empowered to maintain high standards without fear of retaliation from entitled students. Mark's engineering firm received unexpected attention when his support for Sarah during the media storm was reported in local business publications. His principled stance and methodical approach to handling the crisis impressed potential clients and resulted in several new contracts for infrastructure projects throughout Michigan. Charlie, their golden retriever, became something of a local celebrity when news outlets featured photos of Sarah walking him through Cedar Falls' peaceful neighborhoods. The dog's obvious happiness and health served as visual evidence that their owner was a nurturing person rather than the dangerous individual some critics had portrayed. Detective Gonzalez was promoted to captain partly based on her thorough investigation of the Riverside High case, which had become a model for handling school violence incidents. Her careful documentation and professional approach had prevented the case from becoming bogged down in political maneuvering or social media manipulation. District Attorney Walsh used the successful prosecution as a cornerstone of her re-election campaign, demonstrating her commitment to protecting educators and holding privileged offenders accountable for their crimes. The case helped establish her reputation as a prosecutor who wouldn't be intimidated by wealth or political connections. David Kim received recognition from the Michigan Student Ethics Council for his courage in providing evidence that ensured justice for his teacher. His decision to come forward despite potential social consequences inspired other students throughout the state to speak up when witnessing harassment or abuse. The Robotics Club at Riverside High dedicated their next competition robot to David, naming it Witness in honor of his moral courage and technical skills that had captured the crucial evidence. The team's success in state competitions brought positive attention to the school after months of negative publicity. Maya Santos was elected student body president in a landslide victory, her platform of supporting teachers and preventing harassment resonating with classmates who'd been inspired by her advocacy for Sarah. Her leadership helped heal divisions within the school community and established new norms of mutual respect. Mrs. Chen was named Teacher of the Year by the Cedar Falls Education Foundation, recognition that acknowledged both her decades of dedicated service and her mentorship of Sarah during the crisis. Her experience and wisdom had proved invaluable in navigating the complex political dynamics surrounding the case. Roberto received a commendation from the school board for his years of quietly documenting harassment incidents and supporting teachers who faced intimidation. His detailed maintenance logs had provided crucial timeline evidence for the prosecution and demonstrated the systematic nature of the attacks. The 4 convicted students faced ongoing consequences that extended far beyond their criminal sentences. College admissions were revoked, athletic scholarships disappeared, and their families' reputations in Cedar Falls' small community suffered permanent damage from their children's actions. Jake Rodriguez's father lost several major manufacturing contracts when clients decided they couldn't trust the judgment of someone who'd raised a son capable of coordinating an assault with rope. The family's economic influence in Cedar Falls diminished significantly as their business struggled with the ongoing publicity from the case. Connor Walsh's football career ended permanently when universities withdrew scholarship offers following his conviction for assault. His dreams of playing college sports were replaced by mandatory community service and anger management counseling that forced him to confront the consequences of his violent behavior. Aiden Brooks discovered that his digital manipulation skills, once a source of social power, had become a permanent liability in an era where employers routinely searched online histories. His conviction for tampering with evidence followed him through multiple attempts to rebuild his reputation and start fresh in new communities. Chloe Patterson's academic achievements were overshadowed permanently by her conviction for organizing harassment campaigns, with college admissions officers viewing her high grades as evidence of manipulative rather than intellectual abilities. Her dreams of attending elite universities were replaced by the reality of limited options and ongoing psychological treatment. The rope that had been intended as a tool of intimidation was entered into evidence and eventually displayed in Detective Gonzalez's office as a reminder of how quickly teenage pranks could escalate into serious criminal activity. The thick, braided cord served as a visual representation of the dangerous mindset that had nearly destroyed multiple lives. Sarah's classroom became a pilgrimage site for educators from across Michigan who wanted to see where a teacher had successfully stood up to systematic harassment and physical assault. Her story inspired policy changes at schools throughout the state as administrators recognized the importance of protecting faculty from student violence. The parking lot where the confrontation had occurred was repaved and equipped with enhanced lighting and security cameras, physical changes that symbolized Riverside High's commitment to preventing future incidents. The improved safety measures helped restore confidence among faculty members who'd been concerned about their personal security. The video footage captured by David Kim was preserved in the school district's archives as training material for future administrators and teachers. The comprehensive documentation of escalating harassment followed by physical assault provided a textbook example of warning signs that should trigger immediate intervention. Sarah's marriage to Mark grew stronger throughout the ordeal, as they navigated intense public scrutiny and legal proceedings together. Their partnership, tested by circumstances neither had anticipated, emerged more resilient and deeply connected than before the crisis began. The golden retriever Charlie adapted to their increased public profile with typical canine aplomb, enjoying the additional attention from neighbors and students who recognized him during walks through Cedar Falls. His presence provided emotional support for Sarah during the most stressful periods of media coverage and legal proceedings. The small apartment that Sarah and Mark called home became a sanctuary from the outside world's chaos, a place where they could process the dramatic changes in their lives without external pressure or scrutiny. The mismatched furniture and hiking photos remained unchanged, anchoring them to their original vision of peaceful suburban life. Coach Ramirez contacted Sarah after learning about her background through news coverage, offering advanced training opportunities for someone with her obvious tactical skills. His recognition of her professional abilities provided validation that she'd acted appropriately given her training and the threatening circumstances. The martial arts studio where Sarah had once taught military personnel became part of the public record when journalists investigated her background, though specific details about classified programs remained protected. The revelation added credibility to expert witness testimony about her qualifications to assess and respond to physical threats. Local law enforcement agencies began consulting with Sarah about self-defense training for educators, recognizing that her unique combination of teaching skills and tactical expertise could benefit other faculty members facing similar threats. Her willingness to share knowledge helped strengthen security awareness throughout the educational community. The case study developed from Sarah's experience was incorporated into criminal justice and education curricula at universities throughout the Midwest, providing future teachers and administrators with real-world examples of escalating harassment and appropriate responses. Her story became a teaching tool for multiple professions. Cedar Falls' community healing process was gradual but genuine, with residents eventually taking pride in how their institutions had handled a difficult situation. The town's response to the crisis, from law enforcement through the courts to school administration, demonstrated that justice could prevail even when wealth and influence attempted to obstruct accountability. The Halloween decorations that had seemed so innocent on the night of the parking lot confrontation returned the following October with added significance, their cheerful facades a reminder of how quickly ordinary suburban life could be disrupted by violence and hatred. Sarah found herself appreciating simple pleasures more deeply after experiencing genuine threat. The engineering blueprints that Mark had been grading on the evening Sarah came home from the assault remained on their kitchen table for weeks afterward, a tangible reminder of the normal life they'd been building before circumstances thrust them into the public eye. The mathematical precision of his work provided comfort during a period dominated by emotional chaos. The custodial staff at Riverside High, led by Roberto, became unofficial guardians of faculty safety, their increased vigilance and willingness to report suspicious behavior creating an early warning system that helped prevent future harassment campaigns. Their dedication demonstrated how crucial support staff could be in maintaining school security. Sarah's cardigan collection, once a symbol of her desire to blend invisibly into suburban life, became armor that protected her true identity while allowing her to maintain the teacher persona she'd chosen for her new career. The soft fabrics masked the tactical awareness that had saved her life and brought justice to her attackers. The wire-rimmed glasses that had been knocked askew during the parking lot confrontation were replaced with identical frames, their familiar weight on her nose. A reminder of how quickly ordinary objects could become evidence in criminal proceedings. The simple accessory represented her commitment to the intellectual life she'd chosen over physical conflict. Mrs. Chen's mentorship evolved into a genuine friendship, as the two educators bonded over their shared experience of surviving in a profession that demanded both intellectual rigor and emotional resilience. Their collaboration on curriculum development brought innovative teaching methods to Riverside High's English department. The messenger bag that had remained on Sarah's shoulder throughout the assault became a symbol of her dedication to education, even under extreme stress, its continued presence demonstrating that her commitment to teaching transcended any temporary disruption caused by criminal behavior. The leather satchel carried lesson plans and hope in equal measure. Principal Harrison's transformation from conflict-avoidant administrator to decisive educational leader, inspired other principals throughout the district to take harassment complaints more seriously and respond more quickly to signs of systematic intimidation. His evolution demonstrated that crisis could catalyze positive change when handled with integrity and courage. The robotics lab where David Kim had been working when he witnessed the assault became a symbol of how technology could serve justice when operated by individuals with strong moral compasses. The sophisticated equipment that captured crucial evidence represented the positive potential of digital tools in the right hands. The courtroom where justice was ultimately served became a destination for legal professionals, studying cases involving educator protection and self-defense rights. The proceedings demonstrated how thorough investigation and skilled prosecution could overcome attempts to use wealth and influence to escape accountability for criminal behavior. Sarah's story inspired legislation at the state level requiring enhanced training for school administrators about recognizing and responding to systematic harassment campaigns against faculty members. Her experience provided real-world evidence for the need for stronger protections for educators facing student violence. The social media platforms that had initially amplified misleading information about the parking lot incident eventually became vehicles for spreading accurate information about educator protection and the importance of supporting teachers facing harassment. The same technology that had threatened Sarah's reputation ultimately helped restore it. The lesson plans that Sarah had been grading on the evening of the assault, essays about courage and heroism, took on new meaning after she demonstrated both qualities in defense of her own safety and professional integrity. Her students' work had unknowingly anticipated the themes that would dominate their teacher's life. The October evening that had begun with such promise, crisp air and colorful leaves, suggesting the peaceful autumn Sarah had hoped to enjoy in her new life, became instead a dividing line between her old identity and the public figure she'd become. The seasonal beauty remained, but her relationship with it had been forever changed by violence and vindication. The empty parking lot that had witnessed such dramatic events returned to its mundane purpose of providing space for faculty vehicles, but security cameras and improved lighting ensured that no teacher would again face isolated assault without documentation and deterrence. The physical space had been transformed by tragedy into a safer environment. Cedar Falls itself emerged from the national attention stronger and more unified, its institutions having passed a severe test of integrity and competence under extreme pressure. The small Michigan town had demonstrated that justice could prevail, even when powerful interests attempted to obstruct accountability through wealth and political influence. The rope that had been intended as a tool of intimidation became instead a symbol of how quickly criminal intent could be documented and punished when law enforcement and the justice system functioned properly. The thick braided cord represented both the threat Sarah had faced and the evidence that had secured her vindication. Sarah Mitchell, the quiet English teacher who had sought only to educate young minds and live peacefully with her husband and dog, had become something she'd never intended to be, a symbol of educator resilience and the importance of standing up to harassment regardless of the personal cost. Her story resonated far beyond Cedar Falls, inspiring teachers throughout the nation who faced their own challenges with difficult students and inadequate administrative support. The transformation was complete, but it wasn't the transformation anyone had expected. Instead of being driven away by harassment like her predecessor, Sarah had emerged stronger and more committed to education than ever before. Her classroom became a beacon for students seeking genuine learning and for educators seeking inspiration to continue their vital work despite the challenges they faced. The courage that had erupted in the parking lot that October evening had been forged through years of training and tested under circumstances she'd hoped never to face again. But when the moment came, when 4 teenagers had threatened her with rope and violent intent, Sarah Mitchell had responded exactly as her training had prepared her to do, swiftly, decisively, and with just enough force to neutralize the threat while preserving her own safety and dignity. The story that had begun with harassment and escalated to assault had ended with justice and renewal, proving that truth and evidence could overcome even coordinated campaigns of intimidation and manipulation. Sarah's experience demonstrated that teachers, like all citizens, had the right to defend themselves against violence, and that society benefited when educators were protected rather than abandoned to face threats alone. The lessons learned from Sarah's ordeal extended far beyond the specifics of her case, touching on fundamental questions about power, privilege, and accountability in educational settings. Her story became a teaching tool itself, demonstrating to students and administrators alike that actions have consequences regardless of family wealth or social status. In the end, the bullies who had tried to hang the new teacher with rope had indeed made a big mistake, but it wasn't simply underestimating her physical capabilities. Their fundamental error had been assuming that intimidation and violence could prevail over justice and truth when those values were defended by individuals with the courage to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The brutal Krav Maga expert who had emerged from beneath the mild-mannered English teacher's cardigan had protected not only herself but the principle that educators deserved respect and safety in their workplace. Her story would continue to inspire long after the headlines faded and the courtroom drama ended, a reminder that courage could take many forms, but was always recognized when it mattered most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.